Welcome to the Real Crusades History Podcast. My name is J. Stephen Roberts. As usual, I will be your host for this episode. I'm excited about this particular podcast because, well, this is a topic I've been looking forward to. Raynald of Châtillon, probably one of the most controversial, and I think we're going to find out least understood figures from the history of the Crusades. We're going to be talking about Raynald of Châtillon today with somebody who has been studying him quite a bit. I'm going to venture to say one of the foremost experts on Raynald of Châtillon. That is historian Dr. Paul Crawford. Dr. Crawford, it's great to have you with us. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. It's always great to be with you, Stephen.
And joining me also today, co-hosting with me is going to be Peter Sefarian from Real Crusades History. Peter, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Jay.
Well, we're going to go ahead and jump into our topics here. So, Dr. Crawford, let's start off with a little bit of background about Raynald of Châtillon and your interest in him. How did you get interested in Raynald of Châtillon? What attracted you to studying him?
Well, he's a very vivid, colorful figure. It's difficult not to be interested in him no matter what you think about him, because he plays a prominent role in the 12th century Kingdom of Jerusalem, and he's obviously a vivid personality. Regardless of how you refract that personality through various lenses of history. Sir Stephen Runciman gives a very vivid depiction of Raynald. He depicts him as a cowboy, a kind of a trigger-happy sort of fellow that comes out from the west and doesn't understand the east and attacks people randomly and just tears up the countryside. And that, of course, is interesting in and of itself. And at first, I accepted Runciman's verdict, Runciman's description of him. But the more I got to looking at things, the more I thought there was something a little bit fishy, something a little bit wrong about the way he was being depicted, and began to dig a little bit deeper. I discovered, among other things, that some people in the 12th century viewed Raynald as a saint and a martyr. There is a hagiographic text, A Saint's Life, by Peter of Blois, who was one of the premier writers of hagiography in the late 12th century. Peter thought that Raynald should be canonized, and there was a new canonization process by the end of the 12th century. He had written this Passio, this Saint's Life. It had never been translated, and I just ran across it in my graduate school work, and I always had the idea that it would be interesting and useful to translate that into English. I was at a conference in Britain some years ago and got to talking to Bernard Hamilton, who wrote that wonderful article about Raynald, or Raynald as his name is anglicized, The Elephant of Christ, re-evaluating Raynald's position in history. And the more we talked about it, the more we learned that we had a mutual interest in Raynald and a mutual sense that he had not been treated justly by history and by historians. Bernard had also written that wonderful book, The Leper King, I think is the name of it, on Baldwin of Jerusalem, which has some material about Raynald in it. And Bernard said to me that he had always wanted to write a biography of Raynald, and I said, that's funny, I always wanted to translate the Passio, and we looked at each other and said, let's do it. It was a little more complicated than that, but that's about the way it happened. And so he and I have been working with some other people on a volume that will be a biography of Raynald, and then we'll have translations into English of all the sources that deal with him in all the various languages that we can find. So that's kind of the progress of my interest, I guess. A growing sense that the man has not been understood or characterized accurately by most historians. I would say, with the primary exception of Bernard, there have been other people who have sort of revisited Runciman's very negative evaluation of him, but Bernard is the primary person who has reevaluated Raynald.
That's an interesting point, the idea of him as a cowboy. I mean, that certainly is the impression we get from Stephen Runciman, and it's kind of almost a cartoonish kind of villain sort of way he's portrayed by Runciman, and really in the popular culture. And yet, it does make sense to me that there would be something more there that we might be missing, especially, given Stephen Runciman's sort of infamous problems with the way he sort of oversimplifies and even demonizes certain aspects of Crusades history. So tell us a little bit about what we know about Raynald's origins. Where was he from? How did he end up in the Holy Land?
Well, it's interesting you would ask that because I just finished an article on the subject that will be published in a few weeks. And it's a complicated and intriguing question. The answer to the question reveals part of why the man is so interesting as a subject of historical study. Runciman, following Marshall Baldwin, the American historian earlier in the 20th century, characterized Raynald as an upstart, a man with no prospects, an ordinary knight, somebody that a high-born lady like Constance of Antioch or Stephanie of Ultra-Jourdain should not be marrying. And in doing so, they kind of follow the account of William of Tyre, who is a very well-known medieval historian, a very good historian in many ways, but one who was involved in the factional quarrels of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and one who favored the faction that Raynald was not part of. So you have to be careful about William. William doesn't usually lie about people, but he is not at all above misrepresenting the facts by selective omission. And you have to be very careful with him, particularly about what he doesn't say. William says that Constance of Antioch, when she was ready to remarry, remarried this guy who wasn't worthy of her and was almost like an ordinary knight. He uses the weasel word quasi in Latin to describe his status, which is kind of not very nice of William, because the fact is that Raynald was not an ordinary knight in any reasonable sense of the word. That's just flat slander. The French Crusade historian Jean Richard characterized Raynald's family, which is the Lords of Danzy in northern France, as having approached very near the crown of France with their marriages. And if you want to get a look at the sorts of marriages that family had made, take a look at my article. It's kind of intricate and complicated and detailed as genealogical history is, but it's very clear that this was viewed as a family that was suitable marriage material for the highest levels of Western aristocratic and even royal society. They were not kings, but they were marrying brothers and sisters of kings. They were connected to some very high families indeed. So it may be that Raynald was vivid and charming and handsome and attractive, and that may have drawn Constance of Antioch to him, but he was also very highly placed. He was a high nobleman, a very good family. He was born probably about somewhere between 1120 and 1125 in northern France, and came to the Holy Land with Louis VII and the Second Crusade, and then stayed there, and was then one of the 9 commanders operating under the king in some campaigns after the Second Crusade. 7 of those commanders were tenants-in-chief of the King of Jerusalem, that is, second-rank people in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. 2 of them weren't. Raynald was one of the 2 who was not a tenant-in-chief, and was apparently put in place, added to that group of 9 commanders because of his perceived capability as a battlefield commander. So that gives you some of the background both of his family and of his perceived capabilities when he came to the Holy Land.
So this is somebody who already had a lot of prestige attached to his lineage, and obviously must have had some real military talent to take this position that he had. I guess, he would have been in positions of command under, there are several kings that came after the Second Crusade. I mean, we have Baldwin III, King Amalric, and so he was an important person in the Kingdom of Jerusalem through a lot of that period, is what you're saying, Dr. Crawford?
Yes, I think that's a very fair way to put it.
Obviously, Raynald is a very mythologized figure, as we've seen in the film Kingdom of Heaven and so forth. Something I found interesting and that may or may not be particularly egregious or damning of Raynald's character was in John Robinson's book, Dungeon, Fire, and Sword. He talks about how Raynald and Thoros, during their conquest of Cyprus, desperately needed funding for this. So in order to get it, the richest man in Antioch at the time was the patriarch Amory. And so, since Amory initially refused to give Raynald the funds he required, he proceeded to torture him, and he covered him with insects, left him out in the sun. I was just wondering, what do you make of the validity of these claims?
Well, Raynald was a very powerful and forceful personality, and there's no doubt that as basically prince consort in Antioch, he was not particularly gentle in the way he ran things. I don't know that you could have been successful if you had been gentle. The episode, though, with the patriarch of Antioch and the honey and the midges, which is kind of notorious, is again drawn from the pages of William of Tyre, who is not friendly to Raynald because he's in the wrong faction, but he's also not friendly to Raynald because William is a cleric. William is a member of the ecclesiastical hierarchy, and so he's almost bound to take the side of the cleric, the patriarch of Antioch, against Raynald. And William characterizes this as this strong young knight who's getting this poor old cleric who's doddering and weak, and he abuses him. He's such a good old man, and he takes him and he puts him out in the sun and he smears honey on his bald head, and it's just a terrible thing. In fact, the Patriarch of Antioch had quite a reputation for being a miser and a skinflint, so he may not have been entirely justified in the way that he was treating Raynald either, and he also wasn't a weak old man. He was a pretty vigorous young middle-aged man, from what I understand. So I think, again, you have to be careful with William shaping your perception of what's going on here. He is feeding you a line about a faction that he doesn't like. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that Raynald treated the patriarch particularly gently. I don't think he did. And I think that as prince consort, essentially, of Antioch, he was probably closer, I'm going to say this cautiously, to the image of someone who's a little bit aggressive, a little bit forceful, a little bit reckless, maybe, than he was later on. But that brings us to a different part of his life, the captivity for 15 years and the effects that had on him. So I would say you need to go back and very carefully look at what the sources are for that episode, evaluate them for prejudice, because there's definitely prejudice there, and not take everything that William of Tyre says at face value, because he's manipulating us.
Yeah, I think that's kind of been an issue in this particular period of the kingdom's history. You know, that period right leading up to Hattin, William of Tyre does so dramatically shape the way we view this period that we kind of forget that he really was writing from the perspective of a very specific faction within the kingdom. He wasn't just giving us sort of a neutral judgment about these various actors. And the people that were not a part of his faction, their reputations really have suffered. Raynald, obviously, Agnes of Courtenay, all these different figures. So let's go ahead and move on to just the controversy surrounding Raynald, how he's viewed in history. I mean, we've already kind of talked a little bit about this, but so we have these common ideas that he was, a ruthless killer, kind of a cowboy, like you were saying, Dr. Crawford, that he cared more about personal power than the good of the kingdom of Jerusalem. That's certainly how he's portrayed by William of Tyre, and that's how he's put across in a lot of novels. And also this idea that his actions contributed enormously to the kingdom's fall, that like sort of his recklessness played a role in this. Dr. Crawford, do you see any truth in these notions?
Not really. No, especially not when we are evaluating his performance as husband of Stephanie of Villers-Jourdain, as basically the Prince of Villers-Jourdain. The idea that he didn't know what he was doing is manifestly untrue. The idea that he unreasonably provoked Saladin, unnecessarily and unreasonably provoked him, which is the picture that you get from Runciman and others like him, is flatly not true. If there was provocation going on, it was pretty obviously on the part of Saladin against Raynald. He was trying to provoke him to do something. In the first place, Raynald is one of the only men who could claim to have defeated Saladin in open battle at the Battle of Montjussard, which usually gets credited to Baldwin, the dying Baldwin, but he was in fact dying. He had leprosy. He, if my memory serves, was carried onto the battlefield at least some of the time in a litter, and delegated command of that battle principally to Renaud. So the victory of Montgisard is largely Renaud's victory. Saladin was very badly defeated in that battle. That speaks very strongly against the idea that Renaud did not know what he was doing from a tactical point of view on the battlefield. But from a strategic point of view, we have to look at that as well. Runciman and others have characterized him as being a highly disruptive force who didn't know what he was doing. He's this dumb Western Christian who comes into a sophisticated, complex East and just acts like a bull in a china shop, knocking things over and breaking everything. From what I can see, and in thinking this, I'm in agreement with Bernard Hamilton. The opposite is more the case. Saladin had a long-term, large-scale geopolitical view. He was working towards uniting the entire Muslim world behind his own leadership, and he understood that in order to do that, you needed not only military success, but psychological and social success. And one of the ways that Saladin was trying to prove that he was the appropriate champion of Sunni Islam was by protecting the holy sites. And if you could disrupt that image of him that he was projecting as protector of the holy sites, you could perhaps put a stick in the spokes of the wheels of his project to become protector of Islam. Renaud clearly tried to do that and mounted that expedition into the Red Sea that Runciman is so contemptuous of. He says it didn't have a hope of success. It was provocative. It was ridiculous. It didn't have a hope of success militarily, but that wasn't the point. Of course it wasn't going to capture Mecca, but it was going to threaten Mecca, and thereby, even in military failure, achieve geopolitical success by demonstrating to the Muslim world that Saladin couldn't even keep raids away from Mecca. And Saladin understood that and reacted with somewhat uncharacteristic savagery when he got hold of the many of the people that were involved in that campaign. He took them 2 by 2 to the various major cities of his realm, took them out in public, and cut their throats like they were slaughtered pigs to try to demonstrate that, yes, he could too protect Mecca. But the fact that Renaud's expedition had gotten so close to it had clearly subverted Saladin's narrative and had frightened and angered him. Runciman also criticizes Renaud for having attacked a caravan or two of Renaud's that was crossing, or of Saladin's rather, that was crossing Renaud's territory. And the Kingdom of Heaven movie even goes so far as to suggest that Renaud grabbed Saladin's sister and dragged her off in the bushes, which is nothing more nor less than slander. There's no justification for that claim at all. If there is provocation in those caravans, it's probably Saladin's, because the evidence is that Saladin was breaking the truce by sending armed caravans into Renaud's territory in contravention of the terms of the treaty and trying to get Renaud to attack him. I don't see how Renaud could reasonably be expected to have ignored that provocation. Runciman says, well, that's what brought Saladin into the Kingdom of Jerusalem and caused Hattin. But Saladin was going to come into the Kingdom of Jerusalem anyway. He already had, and he was going to do it again. And there was no reason for the noblemen of the Kingdom of Jerusalem to lie down and passively acquiesce in that project, which Renaud was not doing.
That is really fascinating. I mean, the Red Sea campaign has always been an issue for me, something that always puzzled me. You know, when you just read kind of the popular accounts, and that's usually the first thing you're going to encounter, it does really sort of strike you as
pointless.
Yeah, what was he doing? What's he trying to do? But when you put it in that respect, the idea that this is about tarnishing Saladin's reputation as the leader of Sunni Islam, that's huge, because in the Sunni world, this was a real struggle going on. I mean, Saladin was not considered the legitimate guardian of Nur ad-Din's heir. The Zengids very much opposed the idea of Saladin becoming sort of some kind of hegemonic power. This was a real struggle, and certainly it would have been enormously disadvantageous to the Kingdom of Jerusalem for Saladin to become this kind of hegemonic dominating factor in Sunni Islam from Egypt all the way to Aleppo or whatever. So that does make a lot of sense. What Raynald was attempting to achieve, it's actually, the interesting thing about it is it sort of shows a mind that's much more in tune with the politics of the East and a lot more subtle and
sophisticated,
strategic mind, as opposed to the idea that this is just a crazy cowboy riding after any caravan he can, with his boys, he can get sight of.
Some kind of brainless panther pouncing on everything that moves.
Yeah. It does seem to me, from what Dr. Crawford is describing Raynald as, is he's not this, this red-bearded drunkard that we see in Kingdom of Heaven so much. He seems more like someone who's very keen for strategy. Does that say a little bit more, Dr. Crawford, about his greater role within the Kingdom of Jerusalem? Was he someone that Baldwin IV looked to for guidance?
He was someone that Baldwin IV relied on rather heavily, and Baldwin made Renaud a major regent of his during some of Baldwin's periods of illness and incapacity. It appears to be true that at one point he and Baldwin IV fell out, although it may be rather that Baldwin IV was making political decisions that Renaud agreed with. At one point, Renaud voluntarily relinquished the regency of the Kingdom of Jerusalem rather than cause factional strife that would have torn the kingdom apart. From what I can see, rather than putting his own interests ahead of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, he did exactly the opposite and put the interests of the kingdom ahead of his own rather selflessly. Baldwin seemed to have a very high opinion of Renaud through most of Renaud's career, and I think the evidence justifies that high opinion.
The slap on the face that Baldwin gives him Kingdom of Heaven probably never happened.
No, I don't think so. In general, where Kingdom of Heaven is concerned, if it says something happened, you can pretty well reverse it, and that will be what the truth is.
Yeah, that's a very good way to look at it. And
rule of thumb.
It's amazing because Raynald of Châtillon has become this widely known figure just in the pop culture, just because of that silly movie.
Yes. Yeah, let me, I've got something in front of me here. It's a quotation from a popular book called Templar Code for Dummies. Here's what they say about Raynald of Châtillon, and it tells you the popular view that's gotten out there. It's talking about the Templar master, Gerard de Ridefort. This is what it says. De Ridfort's closest ally was a murderous and dishonorable liar named Raynald of Châtillon. Raynald of Châtillon, confusingly referred to as Reginald in some books, and that's one of the anglicizations of his name. The author of this book doesn't even know that. And he screwed up everything he touched. I'm quoting directly here. He was no fit company for the king or de Ridefort. On a lighter note, he'd been imprisoned for ransom once by the Muslims, a common practice with a captured lord. After 16 years, no one liked him well enough to put together the ransom money, and so the exasperated Muslims let him go. That is flatly not true. They waited until they got an enormous ransom for him. But back to the text. Afterward, he ran around from then until his death, starting wars everywhere he went, breaking treaties, killing Muslim pilgrims, pillaging caravans that were traveling under a pass from both Saladin and the king of Jerusalem, and in general, single-handedly making an all-out war with Saladin inevitable. There's hardly a word of that that's true.
Yeah, it's bizarre. I have no doubt that early on, when I initially was reading about the Crusades, that this impression was in my head too. This idea that Raynald was kind of this roguish kind of fool. But it's really intriguing. I remember the first time I read God's War by Christopher Tyerman. There's just a couple of lines about Raynald of Châtillon in there, but I remember that was the first time my mind started to be opened about what was really going on. Tyerman said that one, like you're saying, Dr. Crawford, Raynald was a supporter of Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, and their policies were in alignment. Raynald was actively taking part in policy that was for the benefit of the kingdom and designed to destabilize Saladin's position within the Muslim world, which that in itself shows, somebody who really is plugged into politically what's going on and is making decisions that have a broader view. And so I just think it's just really frustrating to me how, because we run Real Crusades history, obviously, and we get, people, we get, kind of the front lines of the pop culture. We have people coming in, right? We have people coming in all the time with comments about Raynald. I mean, Raynald is this hideous bully, and thank God that Saladin, delivered justice to him,
Mm-hmm.
And even among just normal people, this is the view they have. I mean, this is you have to look at somebody like Raynald. I mean, this is somebody who really represents the injustice of the Crusades, and this is kind of the frustrating thing about the 21st century Western popular culture is this inability to look at the reality, the political realities of the time, the moral standards of the time, and also, just outright lies built up around this period, around the Crusades. And somebody like Raynald, I mean, what you just read, Dr. Crawford, that little bit of that blurb you just read, which is that's in some popular book, Templars for Dummies, whatever. I mean, that is just utter nonsense.
Like the sources I had read before discovering Real Crusades history by James Reston Jr. and John Robinson. I mean, they all painted this very unkind picture of Raynald. So, but Dr. Crawford, I think you say mainly it comes from just William of Tyre's bias against him?
That's where it seems to be coming from mostly, then filtered through the early 20th century American Crusades historian Marshall Baldwin and picked up then by the British mid-20th century literary figure Stephen Runciman, and then uncritically echoed from there. Runciman, and we've talked about this, Stephen, on the pages of RCH.
Yeah.
Runciman is such a magnificent writer. He's got such a glorious command of the English language, and he is able to produce compelling and vivid narratives that are so vivid and compelling that people don't stop to look behind them. But Runciman actually was regrettably very careless in the way he did his research. You can find some interesting stuff if you look at his footnotes, places where he's completely wrong. And more than that, as I think either one or both of you said before, he had a very serious prejudice that he brought to the study of the Crusades and allowed to color his narrative. And that prejudice has then been passed on to an awful lot of the rest of the world, which isn't really the rest of the world's fault. Not everybody can go back and read the sources of history. Not everybody has the training that's required for understanding those sources. For instance, what I said about William of Tyre, you really have to be pretty sophisticated to use William of Tyre because he's sophisticated. He's very good at what he does, and he's good at misleading people, which is unfortunate, but there it is. He's good at misleading people in ways that are very hard to catch, and you have to be very careful with him. So, and ordinary people can't be expected to do that kind of thing. They expect the people that do it for them to tell them the truth, and if that's not the case, then you get a myth that is very, very hard to eradicate. And yes, when we get people showing up on Facebook pages that are dedicated to the Crusades, they generally have no idea what they're talking about when they talk about renown.
It sounds like after William of Tyre's, whatever he was saying about Raynald, that was sort of capitalized by Runciman. And I would think that, this idea of Raynald being this cartoonish villain was sort of looked at by people in Hollywood, people like Ridley Scott, as a good opportunity to have this type of archetype in a Hollywood movie.
Correct, and it also fits the narrative that some people want to advance about the Crusades, that they were a unjustified, unprovoked example of brutish Western bigotry and intolerance. I'm sure we've all encountered that historiographical approach over and over again. The sources simply don't justify it, but it is so deeply rooted in the popular modern imagination that it's very difficult to get people to look at the facts.
Yeah, I mean, somebody like Ridley Scott, who clearly had an axe to grind. I mean, he's simply anti-Christian. He simply wanted to do a hit job on Christianity and a hit job on the medieval Latin West.
I don't claim to know what was going on in Ridley Scott's head because I don't live there, but it is true. So I'm not going to say that I know what his motivation was, but you have to recognize the fact that there was a fuss in the British press over the movie before it was released, a public quarrel between him and some of the very fine British Crusade historians, including but not limited to Jonathan Riley Smith. And they said some very harsh things to and about Ridley Scott's vision of the Crusades. Riley Smith called it bollocks in print, which is pretty strong language. And Ridley Scott didn't really, he made a few small changes to the script, but he didn't really change the philosophical thrust of it. So while on the one hand I don't want to say I know what his motivations were, on the other hand he was warned that he was wrong by the people that have the right to know, and he refused to change. So I'm trying to be charitable, but make what you want of that fact. It doesn't look good.
Yeah, I think Thomas Asbridge specifically made a point of he was initially going to be an advisor whose name was going to be on the film, removed his name from the film.
I have heard that, yes.
Yeah. He's talked about that in some interviews.
Has he?
Yeah, he has. And Ridley Scott tried to get him to change his mind about that. And Asbridge just, he said, I'm not going to put my name on something that's just a complete falsification of the history. And, I certainly don't think we can, Asbridge certainly isn't ideological. I mean...
No, he was simply not wanting to be associated. Good for Tom.
Yeah.
Good.
So let's kind of jump into maybe one of the biggest issues surrounding Raynald's life and his career, and that is the Battle of Hattin. Obviously, he participated at Hattin. He was one of the commanders. Dr. Crawford, tell us about Raynald and Hattin. Obviously, the popular image is that he was instrumental in the defeat at Hattin. His bullheadishness played a role in making this horrible defeat possible. What do you think about all that?
I think that it's probably unjust. And again, we're getting our verdict, our report on the events of Hattin, primarily from the continuators of William of Tyre. And while those are not William himself, they are historical writers in William's party, with every motivation for discrediting the other faction. So once again, I think you have to take what they say with a very serious grain of salt. Nobody is perfect. No commander is perfect. Renaud had demonstrated that he was capable of defeating Saladin in battle, and that's probably why King Guy of Lusignan listened to him. The continuators of William of Tyre cast the Count of Tripoli as a hero, as someone who gave wise, balanced wisdom, but in fact, the Count of Tripoli was a traitor. He had made a side agreement with Saladin that had allowed Saladin to carry out reconnaissance in force through the northern part of the kingdom and through Tripoli, and they had encountered a Templar and Crusader kingdom force and wiped it out, killed them. Raymond had blood on his hands, and he knew it, and he was rather horrified, in fact, from what I can tell by looking closely at the sources, rather horrified at what he had done. So far from him being the voice of reason, the voice of wisdom, and Renaud being wrong, I think Raymond was a traitor. He undermined the side of the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, and maybe created a situation where nobody much could pull their irons out of the fire. I do not think that it's justified to blame the defeat at Hattin on Renaud.
Do you think it's true that Saladin allowed Raymond to escape?
I suspect it, yes. That would be very difficult to prove, and at this point, barring discovering other documents, I don't imagine you could prove it, but it looks profoundly suspicious. And as my own working hypothesis, yes, I do think that he allowed Raymond to escape on purpose. I can't prove that, so don't say I said it was absolutely true, but that's my internal working hypothesis, yes. Well, there's something else interesting about the Battle of Hattin, though, that occurs after the Battle of Hattin, and this is maybe one of the things that drew my attention early on to the need for reevaluating Renaud. Saladin didn't usually randomly slaughter captured enemies. He wasn't above doing it. He didn't mind doing it if it served a purpose. But unlike some of the other counter-crusade leaders like Zengi or Baibars, Saladin didn't do it for the fun of it. Baibars seemed to enjoy it just for its own sake. And if Saladin killed people especially if he killed prisoners, it was usually, in fact, I don't know of any instance where it wasn't, that he thought there was some policy reason for doing it. For instance, after the Battle of Hattin, he had the members of the temple and the hospital, the military order members, executed, rather brutally, and sat and watched them with a smile on his face. It was a horrific scene as amateurs sawed their heads off. Why did he do that? Because he feared them very much, because he knew that they tended to fight to the death. He knew that they wouldn't ransom themselves. He knew that they were utterly dedicated opponents of jihad. And so he wanted them dead. He didn't want them ransomed. He didn't want to play games with them. He just wanted them off the board. There's one other person, other than the members of the military orders, that Saladin murdered after the Battle of Hattin, and I think you know who it was. It was our prince.
It was Raynald, yeah.
He's trying to eradicate the person that he sees as his most dangerous enemy, and if you look at what Saladin himself said, after the Battle of Hattin, Saladin wrote to the caliph in Baghdad and notified him of the victory, and he made a special point of mentioning the fact that he had killed Raynald and thereby removed a very great threat to the Islamic faith and to jihad. So Saladin's own account of the battle put Raynald in a category of a very dangerous opponent that he had neutralized. And I don't see any reason to argue with Saladin's characterization of who was frustrating his plans. Surely Saladin would know that best. Why should we argue with him?
Dr. Crawford, so ultimately, how do you think we should view Raynald in the context of Crusader history? Is he someone that ultimately benefited the Crusader cause, harmed it, both?
I think that Raynald certainly belongs in the category of people like Richard the Lionheart or Baldwin IV, yes. Should he be viewed as someone who ultimately benefited or harmed the Crusader cause? Rather than say yes or no to either one of those, he was someone who was very capable, who was very dedicated to the Crusader cause, who tried very hard to make it succeed, and who failed through lack of resources, not, I think, through lack of his own capacity, but again, through lack of resources. He didn't have the men, he didn't have the supplies, the logistics, the geography to be able to go on defeating Saladin forever. I think that he should be viewed as someone who fought a very valiant battle on behalf of a cause that was simply not going to win. But he tried it anyway because of what he believed in. On the one hand, I suppose someone might say that it's not the part of a professional historian to canonize people one side or another, but I think it is the part of a professional historian to recognize human achievement, to recognize human greatness, to recognize human self-sacrifice and altruism. And I think Raynald meets all of those criteria. So I think that we do not only him, but our own understanding of the past of human history a great disservice if we cast him the way Ridley Scott did in Kingdom of Heaven as this bigoted, drunken buffoon. We're doing ourselves a disservice by that because we're failing to understand parts of human history, and in as much as we do that, we damage ourselves.
Yeah, it's a good point. For me, my fascination with the Middle Ages has always driven me to want to understand this period of time because it's difficult because we do live in a world that has all these fantasies, I guess, about the medieval world. And it's if you really care about history and you really want to know what was going on, you do have to get past that. And I think, this is almost an embodiment of that, looking at somebody like Raynald of Châtillon, because here we have someone who, even among people who might style themselves as informed about the Crusades, simply just get it completely wrong. I mean, we really cannot understand what was going on in this encounter between the Kingdom of Jerusalem and Saladin, leading up to Hattin, if we get Raynald of Châtillon wrong. So I think
right.
Yeah, I think the work you're doing, Dr. Crawford, and that you're doing with Bernard Hamilton, I mean, this is an enormously important thing. I think we all look forward to when your book is completed. It's gonna be one of the important works for anybody trying to understand the Crusades. So, when is that going to be out, Dr. Crawford?
Well, we don't know for sure yet. It's mostly done. Part of the problem is that I need to get the time to finish editing it. We have had some snags in preparing it. It requires a pretty extensive team of scholars because the languages involved are extensive. None of us command all of the languages, and most of us don't command the majority of them. So we've had to farm out the various texts to different people. It's been a complicated editing task, and in addition, Bernard himself has had some significant health challenges that have prevented him from doing what he wanted to do with the book, and that's fallen to me to do instead, and I have a very heavy teaching load. So it's kind of waiting for me to get the time to put the finishing touches on it and get it off to a press, and there is interest from a couple of presses, distinct interest in it.
Yeah,
I need to hurry up and get it done is the status of the book.
Well, hopefully this podcast will kind of provide a little much-needed preview and just a place where people can get some information about Raynald of Châtillon from somebody who really has spent time with the sources, somebody who really knows the sources well. So, really glad to have you on for this episode, Dr. Crawford. I think this was an important episode, so thanks so much for being here.
It was a great pleasure to be on, as always. Thank you.
Excellent. And Peter, I really appreciate you co-hosting with me. Thanks for your work there.
Hey, thanks a lot for having me. I appreciate it. And Dr. Crawford, it was great talking to you. Hope we can do this again sometime.
Good to talk to you again, Peter. I hope so.
So yeah, this is the Real Crusades History Podcast. Thanks so much for listening with us today. Again, I'm J. Stephen Roberts, and you can find us at realcrusadeshistory.com. We release a new podcast or video every Monday, so thanks so much. Thanks for watching. My new book, Why Does the Heathen Rage?, a novel of the Crusades set during the reign of King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, is now available in paperback and Kindle on Amazon. Please click on the link in the About box of this video to get your copy. Also, if you would like to support Real Crusades History by offering a donation, you will find a PayPal donate link in the About box of this video. Thank you.